Have you ever experienced a nightmare so terrifying it seemed to bleed into reality? Imagine being stuck in a nightmare that doesn't end when you wake up, one that follows you, keeps you in its grip, and makes you question what's real and what's not. This is one of those stories. The day seemed like any other. The sun rose, casting a warm orange glow across the horizon as I prepared for my next mission. It was just another routine flight. The briefing was short, the weather report was clear, and all of the equipment checks had been completed without issue. Everything was in place for a standard journey, something that didn't warrant a second thought. I had flown so many hours at this point that it had become second nature. I had dealt with storms, turbulence, and mechanical failures. Nothing ever really shook me anymore. Or so I thought. As soon as I entered the cockpit, I felt it. The air was different. It wasn't something tangible I could pinpoint right away, but it was there, hanging in the atmosphere like an invisible weight pressing down on me. The usual hum of the airplane, the soft vibrations that were a comfort to me, were strangely absent. Instead, the cockpit felt oddly still, too still. I glanced around, adjusting my seat, flicking a few switches, and checking the controls again. Everything seemed normal, yet nothing felt right. The air felt dense, as though something was holding its breath, waiting. I shook off the discomfort, trying to focus on the task at hand. The flight attendants moved around the cabin, preparing for takeoff, and I went through the pre-flight checklist with practiced ease. My co-pilot, Michael, sat beside me, his face calm, focused as always. But there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place, that made me uneasy. He looked distant, as though something else occupied his mind. I didn't mention it to him. I didn't want to acknowledge it myself, but the unease in my stomach grew. As the plane taxied down the runway, I felt a strange sensation, a tightening in my chest. It wasn't anxiety, but something deeper, more primal. I told myself it was just the pressure of the mission, but I knew better. I had flown in far worse conditions without feeling this kind of apprehension. As the plane finally left the ground, the moment of ascent should have been familiar, soothing even, but it felt like we were being pulled into something that wasn't quite right. We reached cruising altitude smoothly. The world below shrank, the city lights disappearing into the distance. I watched the horizon stretch wide, the endless sky now open and free, just as it had been countless times before. But this time there was something oppressive about it. The sky wasn't the usual bright blue. It was darker, almost gray, the clouds hanging low and thick. The world below seemed so small, so far away, and yet I felt like I was on the edge of something. Something was out there, beyond the aircraft, watching us. I glanced at Michael. He was still staring out the window, his face expressionless, eyes wide. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, but it wasn't the steady focus of a pilot in control. It was something more distant, almost as if he wasn't seeing the sky at all. It was a vacant, haunted look. His fingers, which should have been resting comfortably on the controls, twitched slightly, as if he were trying to hold himself together. "You okay, Mike?" I asked, trying to break the silence. His response came slowly, as if he were dragging himself out of a trance. "Yeah, just feeling a bit off today," he muttered, his voice quieter than usual. He didn't look at me when he spoke. Instead, he turned his attention back to the window, as if something had caught his eye. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a sense of urgency in the way he held himself, like he was anticipating something. "Do you see that?" he asked suddenly, pointing toward the clouds outside. His finger was trembling ever so slightly. I looked in the direction he was pointing. The clouds were thick, swirling in an unnatural way, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that should have caused the hair on the back of my neck to rise. I shook my head. "What do you mean?" It's just clouds." But Michael's face was pale, his lips pressed together in a tight line. His eyes were still fixed on the same spot. "No, it's not just the clouds," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "There's something up there." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what he was seeing, or if it was simply a trick of the light, but I knew that whatever was bothering him was starting to bother me too. The plane felt different now. The air around us felt colder. I glanced at the cockpit instruments, but everything was running normally. The fuel levels were stable, the altitude was accurate, and the plane's systems were all functioning. But the sense of wrongness remained. The intercom crackled to life, and the voice of the flight attendant came through, asking if everything was okay in the cockpit. I hesitated before responding. I didn't want to alarm anyone, but I also didn't want to ignore the growing sense of dread that had begun to settle in. I answered her quickly, my voice calm but steady, pretending like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Everything's fine, just a minor issue. Thanks for checking in," I said. But as I spoke, the cabin lights flickered. I thought nothing of it at first, probably just a glitch. But when the lights flickered again, this time followed by a strange, almost imperceptible hum, my stomach dropped. It wasn't the usual sound of the airplane engines or the hum of the electronics. This hum was low, almost too deep, vibrating through my bones, like a low frequency that wasn't meant to be heard. I looked at Michael again, but this time his face was ashen, his hands gripped tightly on the edge of the console. He wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was staring straight ahead, his pupils dilated, his breathing shallow. The hum seemed to fill the space around us, vibrating through the walls of the cockpit. "What is that noise?" I asked, my voice shaky. Michael didn't respond. He was breathing heavily now, like he was struggling to take in enough air. He turned to face me, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His mouth worked silently, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the hum ceased. We sat in silence, the only sound the soft whir of the plane's engines and the occasional creak of the cockpit. But the unease in the air remained, thicker now, like a presence just beyond the threshold of our perception. Something wasn't right. The lights flickered once more, but this time they didn't return to normal. They dimmed, casting strange shadows that stretched across the walls of the cockpit. I looked at the gauges, adjusting them, trying to maintain control of the plane, but the instruments began to flicker in and out of focus. I checked the radio. Static. No communication. Nothing. I turned to Michael again, but he had gone completely still, his face contorted in a look of absolute terror. His eyes were locked onto something in the distance, his body rigid. My own heartbeat quickened, my pulse hammering in my chest. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from turbulence or uncertainty. It was something deeper. It was the fear of the unknown, the kind of fear that crawls under your skin and makes every nerve scream in terror. And then, the voice came. At first it was faint, almost a whisper like it was coming from far away. It crackled over the intercom, distorted, barely audible, but unmistakable. A low, guttural voice, as though it were speaking directly into my mind. "You are not meant to be here." The words sent a chill down my spine, a chill that spread through my entire body. I turned to Michael, but his face was blank, his eyes unseeing, as if he hadn't heard the voice at all. It felt like the voice was for me, not for him. It was meant to pierce through the fog of reality and reach into my deepest fears. My breath caught in my throat as the words echoed in my head. I grabbed the radio, but it was nothing more than static. The voice continued, low and slow, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. "You should not have come." If you're feeling the tension building and your heart racing, make sure to hit the like button and share this story with someone who loves a good, spine-chilling experience. Trust me, things are just getting started. Stick around. The nightmare is only beginning. The tapping stopped for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by an even more unsettling sound. A low hum, so deep it seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It wasn't the usual hum of the engines or the familiar noises of the aircraft. This sound was wrong. It felt as if it were coming from within the plane itself, as though something deep within the structure of the aircraft had awoken. I could feel it in my bones, like a frequency that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. I turned to Michael, but his face had gone pale. He was staring straight ahead, his mouth slightly open, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes flickered around the cockpit as if searching for something unseen. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the console, but there was no sound from him. No words, just a deep, unnatural silence hanging in the air. "Mike?" I said, my voice shaky as I tried to reach out to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear me. His gaze remained fixed on some point in the distance, his pupils dilated, and his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. I glanced at the instruments, hoping to find something, anything, that would give me some kind of explanation. But the readings were all normal. The altitude was steady, the speed was constant, and the plane's systems seemed fine. But something wasn't right. My skin crawled with the sensation that we were no longer in control of our surroundings. The hum seemed to seep into my mind, filling the space between my thoughts, clouding my senses, warping my perception of reality. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped suddenly, but it wasn't just a slight chill. It was a bone-deep cold that cut through the air like ice. I could see my breath misting in front of me, and when I glanced at Michael, he was shivering, his face flushed with the unnatural cold. I reached over to adjust the temperature controls, but they were already set to the usual comfortable setting. Nothing had changed in the cabin, and yet the cold remained. A voice came through the intercom. It was distorted, almost as if the signal was being scrambled. I barely recognized the flight attendant's voice, but she sounded far away, distant, like she was speaking through a fog. "Is everything okay in the cockpit? We've been receiving reports of strange activity. Is there anything you need?" Her voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the underlying concern in it. I hesitated before responding, not wanting to alarm her, but the weight of the atmosphere pressing in on me was too much to ignore. "We're fine," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady, but the words felt hollow, as if I were trying to convince myself more than her. "Just a small issue. Everything's under control." I could see the concern in her face through the small window between the cockpit and the cabin. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and moved away. As soon as the door slid shut behind her, I felt the oppressive silence return, heavier than before. Michael was still staring at the window, his face slack with fear. His fingers twitched on the console, but it was as if he couldn't bring himself to move. His entire body was frozen, tense, as though he was fighting against some unseen force. I reached out to him again, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't respond. It was as if I wasn't even there. I turned back to the cockpit instruments, trying to focus, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. But as I did, the lights flickered above us, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before the emergency lights kicked on. The dim red glow bathed the cockpit in an eerie light, casting long, sharp shadows across the walls. The hum in the air grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the plane like it was coming from deep beneath the floorboards. The temperature continued to drop. It wasn't just uncomfortable now, it was unbearable. I felt my skin begin to prickle, goosebumps spreading across my arms as I shivered uncontrollably. My breath came out in visible clouds, and I could see Michael's breath fogging the air as well, though he wasn't even moving. It was as if the very atmosphere had turned against us. The tapping came again, this time louder, more urgent. It sounded like it was coming from outside the plane, tapping against the window, though I couldn't see anything through the thick layer of glass. I turned to look, but there was nothing, just the dark sky and the swirling clouds. No birds, no aircraft, nothing. Just an endless stretch of nothingness. But the tapping continued, soft at first, then faster, more rapid, as if something was trying to get our attention, but there was nothing outside. I leaned forward, peering out the window, my heart racing. I didn't want to believe it, but something in my gut told me it wasn't just the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural, it wasn't right. "Mike," I said again, this time shaking him harder, my voice rising in panic. "Mike, talk to me. What's going on?" He didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the window. His face was pale, drained of all color, as though he had seen something he couldn't process. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He was trying to speak, but his voice was trapped, lost somewhere deep inside him. I reached out, touching his arm, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in, but his skin felt cold, unnaturally cold, like he was frozen from the inside out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and the hum in the air intensified, vibrating through the entire cabin. My body was shaking, and my mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But then, I heard the voice again. This time it was clearer, more distinct, like it was speaking directly to me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as the words echoed in my mind. "You are not meant to be here." The voice was deep, distorted, as though it was coming from a place far beyond the plane. It wasn't coming from the intercom, not from any visible source. It was inside my head, a voice that didn't belong in this world. The words hit me like a physical blow, my chest tightening with fear. "Michael!" I shouted, but there was still no response. His face remained blank, his eyes unseeing. I turned back to the cockpit window, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The tapping continued, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, reverberating through the walls of the plane, through my mind, filling the entire cabin with its rhythmic beat. The lights flickered again, plunging the cockpit into darkness for a moment, before the red emergency lights kicked on again. Everything felt wrong. The air was thick with something I couldn't see, but I could feel it, an oppressive presence pressing in on us from all sides. I reached for the controls, hoping to steady myself, to get us back on track, but the plane felt different now. The instruments were dimming, the readings flickering as if they, too, were being consumed by whatever force had taken hold of the plane. The voice spoke again, louder this time, its words more clear, more demanding. "You should not have come." My hands gripped the controls, but I couldn't bring myself to move them. The plane, the cockpit, everything around me felt unreal, distorted. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each pulse a reminder that something was terribly wrong. And yet, I couldn't escape. Whatever was happening, whatever force had taken control of this flight, it had already taken root in my mind. There was no going back. The air pressure shifted suddenly, and for a moment, I thought the plane was going to drop from the sky. I grabbed the controls tightly, but they slipped through my fingers like they were made of smoke. The entire aircraft seemed to vibrate, shaking in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The hum intensified, now almost deafening, as though it were trying to break through my skull. And then, through the cockpit window, I saw it. A figure. No, not a figure. A shadow. It wasn't solid, wasn't defined, but it was there. A dark shape standing just outside the glass. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence was undeniable. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything from this world, and it was watching us. Are you feeling the fear set in? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think is out there. What do you think the figure wants? What's causing the tapping? Share your thoughts and theories with me. Let's talk about this together. The shadow outside the window loomed larger, its presence more oppressive with each passing second. It was no longer just a vague, shifting silhouette at the corner of my vision. It was becoming solid, almost tangible, a form that seemed to press against the glass, like it was trying to break through. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, a suffocating presence that filled the cockpit with an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned to Michael, hoping to find some semblance of understanding, some shred of rationality. But he was still frozen, his body as stiff as a board, his face expressionless, like he wasn't even aware of the nightmare unfolding around us. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead. He didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if he had been swallowed by the darkness outside. The air in the cockpit grew colder still, but not in a natural way. It was as if the very atmosphere around us was being drained, leached of warmth, leaving only a biting, unnatural chill. I could see my breath forming in front of me, misting in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. It wasn't just cold, it was oppressive, suffocating, like the very air was turning against us. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't coming from the intercom or even from within my own head. It was all around me, vibrating through the walls of the plane, filling the space with a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "You are not meant to be here." The words were like a physical blow, sharp and hard, hitting me with a force that made me stumble back in my seat. I gasped for breath, my heart racing in my chest as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. I reached for the controls again, but they slipped through my fingers, as if the very plane had become alien, foreign to me. The instruments were still flickering, the readings jumping erratically, as if the very systems were being distorted by whatever force had taken hold of the aircraft. The shadow outside the window was growing stronger now, more defined. I could see it pressing against the glass, the outline of a figure, tall and looming, its form flickering in and out of existence, like it was both there and not there at the same time. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was something else, something darker, something that didn't belong in this world. I turned back to Michael, shaking him, desperate for any sign of life, but his skin was cold to the touch, and his body was stiff, unyielding. His eyes were still locked on the window, unblinking, unseeing, as though whatever he had seen outside had frozen him in place. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breaths becoming shallow and quick as I fought to maintain control. My hands gripped the seat, my fingers digging into the leather as I tried to stay grounded, to keep my mind from shattering. The tapping started again, louder this time, more urgent. It was coming from the outside, but it wasn't like any sound I had ever heard before. It wasn't the tapping of rain against the window, nor the sound of hail striking the aircraft. It was a deliberate sound, rhythmic, as though something, someone, was trying to get our attention. I leaned forward, my face pressed against the glass, peering out into the dark, swirling clouds. I couldn't see anything at first, just the endless expanse of sky and cloud. But then, just as the tapping reached its peak, I saw it. The figure, the shadow. It wasn't just outside now, it was on the other side of the glass, as though it had moved closer, pressing against the window. I recoiled in horror, stumbling back in my seat as my heart raced. The figure outside wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should have been there. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape shifting and flickering, as if it were made of shadow itself. I could see no features, no face, no limbs, but I could feel its presence, feel the weight of it pressing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the tapping stopped. The figure outside the window faded, its presence dissolving into the darkness of the storm. But the feeling of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating, like the air itself had been poisoned by its touch. The voice returned, clearer now, its words slow, deliberate, each syllable dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have come. You belong to us now." I froze, the words sinking deep into my chest, wrapping around my heart like a vice. The air in the cockpit grew heavier, more oppressive, until I could barely breathe. The plane felt like it was suffocating, like it was caught in a vice, slowly being crushed under the weight of some unseen force. I tried to speak, to call out, to do something, but no sound came from my mouth. My throat was tight, constricted, as if something invisible was holding me down, preventing me from moving. I turned back to Michael, but he hadn't moved. His eyes were still wide, unblinking, staring at the window as though he was transfixed by something I couldn't see. I reached out to touch his arm again, but his skin was like ice, unnaturally cold, as though the life had been drained from him. There was no response from him, no sign that he was even aware of me. The figure outside the window was gone, but its presence remained. The plane continued to shake, the controls still unresponsive. I could feel the engines struggling, as though they were fighting against the air itself, fighting against the very force that had taken hold of us. The sound of the engines, usually so steady and reassuring, had become a harsh, distorted noise, screeching in and out like the plane was being torn apart. I had to do something. I had to find a way out of this, but the longer I stayed in the cockpit, the more I felt like I was losing myself. The voice, the shadow, it had already begun to take root in my mind. I could feel it, like a cold presence inside my thoughts, slowly turning everything I knew upside down. It was whispering to me now, its voice a low, threatening hum that resonated deep in my chest. "You cannot leave. You will never leave." The words sank in like a knife, twisting my mind, sinking into my soul. I grabbed the controls again, but the plane bucked beneath me, as though it were fighting me, resisting my every move. The instruments flickered wildly, the readings jumping, spinning in erratic patterns that made no sense. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't control the plane. I couldn't control anything. And then, I saw it again. The figure outside the window wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had taken form, had become something real, something tangible. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was something that was right there, in front of me, pressing against the glass like it was trying to get in. Its shape was growing clearer, more defined, though still completely unrecognizable. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on a form, had become something that could touch us, something that could reach us. I slammed my hands against the controls, desperate to regain control, to break free from whatever had taken hold of the plane. The shadow on the window loomed larger, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape. You will never escape." I wanted to scream. I wanted to do something, but my body wouldn't move. The fear was paralyzing, a heavy weight that held me in place, that kept me from taking action. The figure outside the window was now directly in front of me, so close I could almost see its details, though they were still shrouded in darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. And then, everything stopped. The plane ceased shaking. The voice fell silent. The tapping, the hum, the cold. All of it disappeared in an instant, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. I looked around, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The plane was still in the air, still flying, but everything had changed. The instruments had returned to normal, the temperature was stable again, and the oppressive weight that had filled the cockpit had lifted, for now. But I knew something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been haunting us, whatever presence had invaded the cockpit, was still out there, still waiting. You're still with me, right? What do you think is going to happen next? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives. The darkness isn't done yet. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying moment.